In the frozen plains of Manchuria, where winter air stings the skin and the landscape stretches into a white, endless silence, there once stood a facility so hidden, so deliberately erased, that even today its exact boundaries remain uncertain. Soldiers stationed nearby knew it only as a water purification plant. Civilians whispered that it was a lumber mill. But every morning, smoke drifted from chimneys that burned day and night, and guards patrolled the perimeter with a vigilance no lumber mill required. What truly happened inside those walls was known to only a handful of men, and they carried that secret like a shadow long after the war ended. This place would become infamous under a name that still chills researchers and historians to this day: Unit 731. The story of Unit 731 begins years before the first experiment, rooted in Japan's rapid expansion across Asia. By the early 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Army was obsessed with finding a weapon that could give them absolute advantage, a way to cripple enemies on a scale beyond conventional warfare. While other nations hesitated to explore biological warfare, Japan saw potential. Diseases had historically wiped out armies and devastated populations. If they could control them, direct them, and release them at will, they believed they could reshape the battlefield. It was an idea that demanded secrecy, ambition, and a leader unburdened by moral limits. They found that man in Dr. Shirō Ishii. Ishii was brilliant, charismatic, and utterly determined. A microbiologist with an ego as large as his ambitions, he traveled the world studying foreign biological programs and returned to Japan convinced that he could build something greater, a military machine fueled not by bullets but by bacteria. He argued to his superiors that biological weapons could turn the tide of any conflict, especially against massive nations like China or the Soviet Union. The military agreed. All Ishii needed was a remote location far from scrutiny where he could conduct research without interference. Manchuria, newly seized and renamed Manchukuo, became the perfect laboratory. In 1936, construction began near Harbin. Villagers saw concrete bunkers rising, steam pipes being laid, and an ever-growing network of buildings surrounded by electrified fences. Guards stood in watchtowers day and night. Workers who asked questions were quietly dismissed. What emerged was a sprawling compound of laboratories, barracks, underground chambers, and sealed cells. It was large enough to house thousands of personnel and isolated enough that no outsider would stumble upon its secrets. The Japanese military declared everything top secret, and the facility's true purpose was known only to its highest-ranking staff. While the complex was being built, another system was forming, one to supply Ishii with test subjects. According to historical archives, arrests increased dramatically across the region. Anyone accused of anti-Japanese sentiment, political dissent, spying, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time could disappear overnight. Families never learned what happened to them. In official documents, these men and women were referred to by a single dehumanizing word, maruta, meaning logs. It allowed researchers to detach themselves emotionally. A log is not a person. A log does not think, cry, or fear. A log can be cut, opened, burned, or discarded. When prisoners arrived at the compound, they passed through heavy metal gates and were led into bare concrete cells. Some came in blindfolded, others were shackled together. They were told nothing. Guards delivered one bowl of rice or millet a day through narrow hatches. Those who remained calm hoped they had been sent to a labor camp. But when doctors in white coats entered the corridors, carrying clipboards and wearing masks, the truth became impossible to ignore. This was not a prison. It was a laboratory, and the prisoners were never meant to leave. Life inside Unit 731 operated with cold precision. At dawn, guards made their rounds. Researchers entered at scheduled hours, taking notes, collecting samples, and marking progress on charts. Outside, the compound looked quiet, almost orderly, but behind locked doors was a world shaped entirely by Ishii's pursuit of biological warfare. Every room had a purpose. Some were filled with cages for fleas carrying plague bacteria. Others housed incubation chambers growing anthraxal cultures. Others were meant for observation, where human subjects were monitored hour by hour. One of the most common procedures involved intentional infection. Prisoners were exposed to plague-infested fleas, cholera-tainted water, anthrax samples, typhus, dysentery, or other deadly pathogens. The scientists watched how quickly symptoms developed, how fever rose, how organs responded, and how long the person survived. When the subject died, researchers immediately performed examinations to study internal effects. A former Unit 731 doctor later admitted during questioning that live examinations were sometimes chosen because they believed it produced more accurate scientific data. Cold weather experiments were equally ruthless. Manchurian winters could reach temperatures of -30°C, and the Japanese army wanted to understand frostbite in extreme detail. Prisoners were taken outdoors or had limbs exposed to freezing water while researchers observed the progression of frost damage. These experiments, non-graphic but severe, provided data that later helped the Japanese develop effective treatments, but at a human cost that is impossible to measure or justify. The facility also served as a weapons testing ground. Grenades, flamethrowers, gas agents, and specialized bombs were tested on prisoners to determine blast radius, lethality, and injury patterns. These tests were conducted with methodical distance markers, notes, and timing devices. To the military, this was essential data. To the victims, it was unimaginable suffering. As the years passed, Ishii's network expanded. His scientists became desensitized, reshaped by an environment where cruelty became routine. Many were young graduates who arrived believing they were serving their country. Slowly, they adopted the mindset that their work was necessary, justified, even patriotic. One former assistant later said that the consistent use of the word Maruta made it easier to ignore the humanity of the people they studied. By the early 1940s, Unit 731 was operating at full scale, producing plague bacteria, cholera agents, and millions of infected fleas. Historians estimate that these were deployed across Chinese villages using specially designed bombs, causing outbreaks that killed thousands. Civilians had no warning. One day a plane flew overhead, days later disease spread through the population with horrifying speed. Japan denied everything. As World War II turned against Japan, the atmosphere inside Unit 731 grew tense. Soviet forces moved closer to Manchuria, and news of Japan's fading power reached the compound. Realizing their secrets were at risk, Ishii ordered a full purge. Documents were burned, buildings were rigged with explosives, prisoners were executed or eliminated quietly to leave no witnesses. Many staff members destroyed their own research or fled with classified notes. The complex, once alive with machinery and footsteps, fell silent as the empire itself began to collapse. By August 1945, when the war finally ended, the men of Unit 731 scattered across Japan, believing their involvement would never be discovered. For a time, they were right. The world had not yet learned the full scale of what had happened in Manchuria. But soon, interrogations, testimonies, and captured documents would begin to lift the veil. And the secrets they revealed would shock far beyond anything Ishii had predicted. When the Soviet Red Army crossed into Manchuria in August 1945, they moved with a speed and determination that rattled every Japanese garrison still holding out across the region. Villages that had lived under occupation for years suddenly found themselves between two collapsing worlds, one retreating, the other advancing. Yet even as Soviet tanks rolled across the plains, a smaller group of soldiers and scientists inside Unit 731 were fighting a very different battle, the battle to erase every trace of what they had done. As explosions echoed in the distance, orders spread through the compound. Burn everything. Destroy every vial, every notebook, every file, every instrument that might reveal the truth. Ishii himself supervised the destruction, walking through laboratories that had once been filled with the hum of machinery and the casual chatter of researchers. Now they were chaotic rooms filled with smoke, toppled cabinets, and frantic personnel shoving documents into furnaces that glowed like miniature suns. Entire rooms of records, years of experiments, procedures, and results disappeared in hours. But some evidence could not be burned. The compound was filled with living witnesses, men and women whose disappearance had long been concealed behind the word Maruta. Guards received another order: no one must survive. According to post-war testimonies, prisoners were removed from cells in groups and eliminated methodically, their bodies destroyed to prevent Soviets from identifying them. Some shots echoed across the yard, others were quieter. For the first and only time, silence inside Unit 731 felt almost louder than the acts committed within it. Outside the walls, the Soviets were closing in. Their intelligence officers had already heard rumors, whispers about strange epidemics, suspicious deaths, and a Japanese disease research center. But no one imagined the scale of what they were about to uncover. Before they arrived, Ishii and his highest-ranking officers fled south, blending into the sea of retreating soldiers and civilians. Behind them, they left a facility that was only partially destroyed. Some structures burned, others were left intact but stripped. Yet even in their hasty evacuation, they failed to erase everything. When Soviet troops finally entered the compound in mid-August, they were struck by the eerie emptiness. Doors swung open in the wind, tables were overturned, hallways smelled faintly of chemicals and smoke. Some walls were scorched, but many rooms were untouched, as if the researchers had vanished mid-step. It felt less like a battlefield and more like a ghost facility abandoned overnight. Investigators moved room by room, taking notes and photographs. They found surgical tools neatly arranged beside restraint devices as if they had been placed for use only hours before. They discovered sealed chambers with reinforced doors and heavy bolts on the outside. Strange equipment lay scattered across desks: pressure chambers, centrifuges, incubators, temperature-controlled boxes. None of it made sense until they found fragments of logbooks and burnt documents that referenced cultures, pathogens, and experimental cycles. One Soviet officer later recalled that the atmosphere inside the compound felt not like a laboratory but a crime scene frozen in time. Suspicion hardened quickly into certainty. Something monstrous had happened here. Meanwhile, thousands of kilometers away in Japan, the men who had run the facility were trying to disappear into civilian life. Ishii shaved his mustache, adopted a new name, and blended into the countryside. Others returned to their families as if the war had merely paused their academic work. For a brief moment, it seemed they might evade accountability entirely. But history does not bury secrets forever. Word of the Soviet discovery spread among Allied intelligence agencies. American investigators, in particular, were eager to understand what Japan had been developing. They knew biological warfare was the next frontier, dangerous, invisible, and almost impossible to defend against. If Unit 731 had produced knowledge that could be useful, U.S. officials wanted to know exactly what it was. In late 1945 and early 1946, American operatives began tracking down former members of the unit. Some scientists confessed reluctantly, others arrogantly, believing their research gave them bargaining power. But all of them spoke with the same detachment, as if they had merely been moving numbers on paper rather than conducting experiments on living human beings. They described infection models, disease progressions, environmental stress tests, and weapon delivery systems. They explained the development of ceramic bombs that could disperse infected insects over cities, the cultivation of plague bacteria in massive steel vats, and field tests conducted on unsuspecting Chinese villages. For the U.S., this information was both horrifying and irresistible. The Cold War had already begun in the minds of many strategists, and biological warfare was seen as an area where the Soviets could gain an advantage. If America didn't acquire the data, someone else would. The moral calculus shifted, and in a decision that remains deeply controversial, American authorities negotiated an immunity deal with Ishii and his senior staff in exchange for their research reports. The Soviets, upon learning this, were furious. They believed Unit 731's crimes warranted trials equal to those at Nuremberg. So, in 1949, they held their own trials in Khabarovsk, revealing publicly the extent of the atrocities. Witnesses described experiments, contamination operations, forced infections, and weapon tests. But despite the damning evidence, the world's attention was already shifting to post-war reconstruction, nuclear tensions, and new geopolitical alliances. Much of the testimony barely reached Western newspapers. Inside Japan, the truth had even less traction. The American Occupation Administration discouraged widespread reporting on Unit 731. The scientists received new jobs, many in prestigious institutions, using their wartime experience to build careers in medicine, pharmaceuticals, and academia. Ishii himself reportedly lived quietly in Tokyo until his death in 1959, never standing trial. Yet silence is fragile. As decades passed, survivors of Japanese occupation began speaking. Relatives of the disappeared demanded answers. Historians started piecing together fragments of burned archives, interrogations, diaries, and Soviet documentation. Slowly, the curtain lifted. What had once been whispered in rural Manchuria became a documented chapter of global history. Still, questions lingered. How far had Unit 731's research progressed? How much had been suppressed by post-war governments? How many victims were never identified? And perhaps the most troubling question of all, what became of the biological agents they developed, and how close did the world come to witnessing their full deployment? The answers to those questions lie deeper within the story, in the field tests across China, the anti-crop operations, the plague outbreaks of 1940 to 1942, and the desperate final months when Ishii attempted something so dangerous it chilled even his superiors. That part of the story is darker still. The final years of Unit 731's operations were marked by a chilling blend of confidence, ambition, and desperation. As Japan's hold on China began to fracture under the pressures of Allied advances and internal collapse, Ishii saw both danger and opportunity. He believed the empire stood on the brink of a scientific triumph, a weapon so devastating that it could reshape the balance of the war. His staff, conditioned by years inside Pingfang's ideology, moved with increasing speed, pushing experiments to extremes they once thought impossible. Every week brought new trials. Every failure demanded replacements, more prisoners, more bodies, more data. The compound's furnaces burned longer than ever, and beyond its perimeter, the fields of Manchuria trembled with rumors that something far worse than standard warfare was unfolding. In this period, Unit 731 expanded its field tests deeper into central and southern China. According to military records recovered after the war, Ishii coordinated several campaigns distributing pathogens through water sources, food supplies, and airborne fleas. Entire communities reported sudden, violent outbreaks. Survivors spoke of fevers that struck without warning, swelling that spread across the body, and illness so rapid it seemed supernatural. Yet these were not natural epidemics. They followed the path of Unit 731's operational plans almost perfectly. Towns near strategic passes, villages close to river crossings, marketplaces filled with refugees. Each outbreak served as a grim data point. Each death fed a report that would later be slid across a laboratory table in Pingfang, where Ishii's staff examined every statistic with clinical fascination. Meanwhile, Ishii pursued a concept he called the decisive blow, a biological attack so massive that it could be used on enemy cities, military installations, or advancing armies. He envisioned ceramic bombs that burst at low altitude, releasing infected insects over wide areas. His officers crafted prototypes with frightening efficiency. Test flights were conducted under strict secrecy, often with unmarked planes. According to some testimonies, Ishii believed that if Japan were ever threatened by invasion, these biological weapons could be deployed on American forces landing on the shores of the home islands. It was a horrifying scenario that came closer to reality than most historians once realized. Inside the compound, the experiments became even more extreme. Researchers intensified frostbite trials, poison gas studies, dehydration experiments, and disease progressions under different environmental conditions. Prisoners were exposed to pathogens in controlled chambers, their symptoms recorded hour by hour. Others were operated on without anesthesia, under the justification that anesthetics might interfere with pure research results. The doctors walked through the surgical wards with calm precision, discussing procedures with the tone of men planning routine surgeries rather than acts of cruelty. This detachment, over time, became its own kind of machinery, an emotional elimination that allowed the unit to function without question or dissent. Yet shadows began creeping into the staff's confidence. Some lower-ranking soldiers, disturbed by what they witnessed, attempted to request transfers. Others reported nightmares, unexplained illnesses, or breakdowns. But within the walls of Unit 731, silence was survival. Any sign of resistance was interpreted as disloyalty. Many kept their heads down, hoping the war would end before the facility demanded even darker tasks of them. Still, the momentum of Ishii's work was unstoppable, propelled by the belief that Japan's future depended on this research. By late 1944, however, the war's trajectory had shifted dramatically. The Pacific Campaign had turned decisively against Japan. American bombers appeared over Japanese cities with increasing frequency. Supplies dwindled. Communications became erratic. Within Pingfang, the atmosphere changed. Scientists worked with the same cold efficiency, but an undercurrent of fear seeped through the halls. Officers argued quietly behind closed doors. Some began to talk about evacuation routes, while others insisted the research must be preserved at any cost. Ishii, now faced with the collapse of his empire's global ambitions, doubled down. If Japan was to fall, he believed, its enemies must not gain access to Unit 731's knowledge. That knowledge, he reasoned, could be his bargaining chip. The turning point came in early 1945, when confirmation reached the facility that Soviet forces were preparing a major offensive into Manchuria. The prospect of the Red Army, known for its uncompromising investigations, discovering Unit 731 struck fear into the entire command structure. Meetings stretched late into the night. Orders changed rapidly. Some staff argued to relocate the research south to Korea. Others pushed to destroy everything immediately. Ishii considered both options, weighing the enormous volume of data, cultures, equipment, and personnel. Every choice risked exposure. Then came the order that sealed Unit 731's fate: prepare for full evacuation. From that moment, the countdown began. Laboratories once filled with precision and order descended into frantic motion. Researchers scrambled together reports, vials, samples, anything that could be moved. The furnaces were fed until their chimneys glowed. Papers curled and turned to ash in endless sheets. Glass shattered as shelves were swept clean. Even the steel vats used for cultivating pathogens were drained, scrubbed, and smashed apart. The goal was clear: erase the story at its source. Yet as the pressure mounted, Ishii made a choice that stunned even some of his closest staff. He ordered preparations for what he believed might be his final, most devastating act: the possibility of launching a biological attack against approaching Soviet forces. Whether this plan ever reached its final stages remains debated among historians. Some documents implied tests were prepared but never executed. Others suggest the chaos of evacuation prevented deployment. But the fact that Ishii seriously considered such an operation reveals how far he was willing to go. As chaos rippled through the compound, the prisoners, the last remaining Maruta, were gathered and eliminated. Their existence, from the perspective of the command, posed the greatest risk of all. These were the final living witnesses, the only ones who could describe what had happened inside Unit 731 with human detail. Their deaths marked the final chapter of the facility's operational cruelty. Within days, the complex fell silent. Trucks carried personnel south toward Japan's mainland. Ishii disappeared into the retreating columns, and behind them, the vast machinery of Unit 731, its laboratories, chambers, and corridors, was left abandoned, fragile, and incomplete. The Soviets were closing in, and the truth, though partially burned, was still waiting behind those concrete walls. When the first Soviet reconnaissance teams crossed the outskirts of Pingfong, they expected to find an ordinary military installation, perhaps a supply depot, perhaps a garrison. Instead, they found a facility that seemed to defy all logic. The compound was enormous, its scale more like a small industrial city than a research center. Wide roads cut through the grounds, connecting warehouses, barracks, administrative buildings, and long, windowless structures that hinted at their hidden purpose. Yet the silence was overwhelming. There were no soldiers, no scientists, no civilians, only the faint echo of wind moving through corridors that had once pulsed with ceaseless activity. Investigators entered cautiously, unsure if the Japanese had left traps or explosives behind. But the danger they feared was not mechanical, it was biological. Some soldiers wore improvised masks, aware of rumors about plague outbreaks and mysterious diseases. Even they could not have imagined how accurate those rumors were. As they moved deeper into the complex, the first signs of Unit 731's purpose began to emerge in disturbing fragments. Steel tables bolted to floors, restraints attached to bed frames, cabinets filled with strange instruments, and scorch marks that indicated documents had been burned in massive volumes. In one building, Soviet officers found heavy metal doors leading into sealed chambers. Some had thick glass panels for observation, others contained large ducts and ventilation controls. The rooms smelled faintly of chemicals, disinfectants, and something else, something sharper. A Soviet lieutenant later wrote that the air felt used, as if fear itself had once breathed here. The investigators photographed everything meticulously. They couldn't explain what they were seeing, but they could sense it was evidence of something unprecedented. Across the compound, they uncovered furnaces still warm, ash piled high inside their chambers. The ash contained bone fragments. Some rooms held surgical tools aligned neatly beside clipped documents that hadn't fully burned. Other rooms contained biological equipment decades ahead of what the Soviets expected from Japan. Large incubation tanks, microscopes of rare precision, and machines that looked like prototypes of later Cold War laboratories. Everywhere they turned, investigators encountered a contradiction: scientific advancement wrapped tightly around human cruelty. It didn't take long for the Soviets to conclude they had uncovered a biological warfare facility. But that discovery raised more questions than answers. How advanced had the program become? How close had Japan come to deploying these weapons at scale? And what had happened to the thousands of prisoners rumored to have been held here? The answers emerged through interviews with locals. When Soviet officers questioned farmers living near the compound, the villagers spoke hesitantly at first, but soon their stories converged. They described mysterious trains arriving in the dead of night. They spoke of people, Chinese, Koreans, Mongols, sometimes Russians, who were marched through the gates and never seen again. They talked about sudden outbreaks of plague or cholera in villages downstream, outbreaks that seemed to follow patterns rather than accidents. And they described strange tests conducted in open fields, bombs dropped from planes, clouds of insects released over farmland, people collapsing within days.
For years, the villagers had whispered these stories in fear. Now, with the Japanese gone, they spoke freely. For the Soviets, the picture sharpened. This was not a medical institute, it was a factory of death. While the Soviets examined the physical remnants, a parallel effort began thousands of miles away, where American intelligence officers were rapidly gathering their own information. Their objective was not to expose the crimes, it was to secure the research. In Washington, military analysts were already anticipating the next major conflict. They believed the Soviet Union, not Japan, would be the next rival. And in that emerging rivalry, biological warfare was an area where early information could shift the balance of power. American intelligence units began tracking down former Unit 731 scientists who had returned to Japan. Some were located in universities, others in hospitals or government offices. A few were in hiding. When questioned, they denied involvement initially, but the Americans arrived with evidence. Fragments were covered from the ruins, testimonies from captured officers, and reports from China. Eventually, the scientists began to talk. What they revealed stunned the interrogators. They described experiments involving plague, anthrax, cholera, typhus, and frostbite. They explained how prisoners were infected intentionally, how symptoms were recorded, and how researchers attempted to perfect delivery systems for battlefield use. However, instead of arresting them, American officials saw a strategic opportunity. They believed the data, gathered over years of unethical experimentation, could accelerate U.S. research by decades. Every detail was potentially valuable: incubation times, transmission behavior, environmental variables, lethality in different conditions. The scientists knew this made them indispensable. Some even demanded immunity and protection for their cooperation. By mid-1946, the American position was clear. If they prosecuted the scientists, the research might be lost, or worse, obtained by the Soviets. So they offered a deal that would become one of the most controversial decisions of the post-war era: immunity in exchange for complete documentation of their work. Many of the reports Ishii supplied were chilling in their precision. They contained charts of disease progression, tables of infection rates, detailed autopsy observations, and descriptions of bomb delivery systems. The U.S. accepted these reports into classified archives where they remained hidden from public knowledge for decades. Meanwhile, the Soviets, furious at the American decision, launched their own investigation. In 1949, they held the Khabarovsk trials, prosecuting 12 former members of Unit 731. The proceedings revealed gruesome details, confirmed by witnesses and documents. Yet Western powers dismissed the trial as propaganda. Only later would historians confirm its accuracy. But even as governments argued over the narrative, the survivors of Unit 731's activities, villagers exposed to disease outbreaks, families whose relatives disappeared, and former prisoners who managed to escape began telling their stories. Their testimonies introduced the world to the human cost behind the scientific coldness of the documents. They described entire communities wiped out by mysterious illnesses, military units collapsing after exposure to airborne pathogens, and the terror that followed Japanese aircraft dropping ceramic bombs filled with plague-infected fleas. Despite their courage, their voices struggled to be heard. Japan, under American occupation, restricted reporting on the unit. Former scientists returned to prestigious positions, some becoming leaders in post-war medical development. Ishii lived quietly, reportedly under American protection, until his death in 1959. For years, Unit 731 remained a whispered horror, known but not acknowledged.
Yet history is patient. Over the decades, evidence resurfaced. Diaries hidden in attics, testimonies recorded by elderly villagers, declassified Soviet records, and research by dedicated historians. Slowly, the truth assembled itself into a narrative too large to suppress. What emerged was not just a chronicle of wartime cruelty, but a warning. Science, when untethered from morality, becomes a weapon more dangerous than any bomb. Still, one question lingered like a shadow across the entire investigation, a question that continues to haunt historians even today. How close did Japan come to deploying its biological weapons on a global scale? The documents suggest a terrifying possibility. During the desperate final months of the war, Ishii may have prepared a plan that could have altered history forever. That plan, and the unanswered dangers surrounding it, forms the next part of this story. Dawn crept slowly over the shattered tree line, painting the ruined village in pale gold. For the first time in days, the air wasn't filled with screams or exploding shells, only the distant rumble of artillery far beyond the valley. Inside the makeshift hospital, the medic walked between the wounded, checking faces he now knew as well as his own. Some slept lightly, some clung painfully to consciousness, and some would never speak again. He paused beside a young soldier, barely 19, bandaged from shoulder to ribs. The boy's breath trembled, fear, exhaustion, and something deeper. "Did we make it?" the boy whispered. "We did," the medic said softly. "You did." A small, almost invisible smile touched the boy's lips. It was the kind of smile men make when they're not sure if they've survived or if they're dreaming. Outside, the villagers began to rebuild what little remained. A broken door propped upright. A pot hung over a weak fire. Life trying to stitch itself together, the same way the medic had stitched flesh through the night. Everyone moved with a quiet respect, aware that the ground still carried the weight of yesterday's horror. As the sun rose higher, Allied reinforcements finally reached the village. The officer in charge stepped into the church-turned-hospital, stunned. He expected a massacre. Instead, he found 200 wounded soldiers alive, barely, but alive. The medic simply stood there, blood dried on his sleeves, eyes hollow but steady. He didn't smile, he didn't bow, he didn't even speak. Because survival wasn't victory. Not yet. He only exhaled, one long, tired breath, as if releasing the night's nightmare back into the air. And for the first time, he allowed himself to feel it, the terror he had swallowed, the weight he had carried, and the fragile, pulsing miracle of every life that still remained. By the winter of 1940, Unit 731 had moved beyond the confines of its Manchurian laboratories. While the compound offered controlled conditions for observation, Ishii and his team were determined to see how their creations, diseases, pathogens, and biological agents, behaved in the chaos of the natural world. The unit began orchestrating field experiments across rural China, targeting both civilians and soldiers with the same cold, scientific precision they had applied indoors. One of the most infamous campaigns involved the deliberate spread of plague. Researchers would release infected fleas into villages, either by dropping ceramic bombs filled with the insects or by placing them in livestock and granaries. The goal was to observe the transmission of disease, the incubation period, and the mortality rate. Villagers had no warning, no means of escape, and no understanding of the invisible enemy descending upon them. Within days, entire families succumbed to fever, bubios, and suffocation. Streets became silent except for the coughs and cries of the dying. Ishii's reports, later seized by the Soviets and Americans, detailed mortality rates, symptoms, and patterns of contagion with the same clinical detachment one might expect in a physics experiment. In addition to plague, cholera, typhoid, and anthrax were tested in similar ways. Prisoners, often labeled maruta, were sent to small towns under the guise of laborers or conscripted workers. Some were deliberately infected and returned to their communities, spreading disease naturally. Others were confined in quarantined compounds where their suffering could be closely monitored. Medical teams recorded temperatures, fluid loss, hemorrhaging, and the progression of internal infections, taking notes on different dosages, delivery methods, or environmental conditions affected survival. The unit also experimented with what Ishii called anti-crop operations. Fields of rice, wheat, and soybeans were intentionally contaminated with pathogens designed to destroy food sources. Famine and disease often followed, compounding the human suffering that accompanied the direct biological attacks. Villagers faced a dual threat: the spread of lethal disease and the destruction of their means of survival. These experiments were, in essence, a full-scale test of biological warfare on civilian populations. While Unit 731 documented every stage, they also developed methods to obscure the evidence. Victims were often incinerated, buried, or left in areas marked as natural deaths from disease. This careful erasure meant that many of the operations left no official record, leaving historians to reconstruct events decades later from survivor testimonies, fragmentary documents, and sporadic Japanese military logs. Meanwhile, Ishii continued to shield his staff from the moral implications of their work. Training sessions emphasized the detachment of the observer. Students and junior researchers were instructed to refer to human subjects as specimens or logs, removing any sense of individuality. Guards were ordered to enforce absolute control, ensuring that no escape or interference could compromise the experiments. The psychological conditioning was as rigorous as the biological tests themselves. In one particularly chilling case, entire villages were isolated, with infected individuals forced to interact with the healthy population under supervision. Researchers monitored the spread, meticulously recording who became ill, how long symptoms took to appear, and which interventions, if any, were effective. The data collected was cataloged in detailed charts and photographs, forming a grim archive of human suffering. By late 1941, Unit 731 had extended its operations further into occupied territories, coordinating with Japanese military units to test the effectiveness of disease as a weapon against enemy forces. Reports describe the use of contaminated water sources, deliberate targeting of livestock, and aerial dispersal of infected fleas. Soldiers who encountered these zones often fell ill within days, while civilians remained defenseless against the invisible threat. The unit treated each outbreak as a controlled experiment, noting the differences between rural and urban environments, temperature and humidity effects, and variations in population density. Even as the world outside plunged deeper into the global conflict, the horrors of Unit 731 continued in near-complete secrecy. Few Japanese officers knew the full extent of the operations, and those who did were sworn to silence. Ishii cultivated relationships with military officials, emphasizing the strategic importance of biological warfare and portraying his work as essential to Japan's future dominance. The line between research and mass murder blurred entirely, with scientific curiosity serving as justification for atrocities on a scale rarely seen in human history. While much of Unit 731's notoriety stems from its biological experiments, an equally disturbing aspect of the program was the psychological conditioning imposed on its staff. Ishii understood that, to carry out the horrors he envisioned, his researchers could not function as ordinary human beings with moral compunctions. They needed to see their victims not as people, but as tools, variables in a grand scientific equation. New recruits were subjected to intensive indoctrination. They studied disease pathology, microbiology, and the mechanics of infectious agents, but they were also trained to suppress empathy. The term maruta, meaning logs or planks, was used consistently to describe human subjects, a linguistic device that stripped identity and humanity from the living. Guards were instructed to enforce absolute obedience, often participating in minor acts of cruelty to harden their psyche before handling the more severe experiments. Ishii himself exemplified the model of the detached observer, often visiting experimental sites unannounced, observing procedures, and providing feedback in clinical terms. Soldiers and scientists alike learned quickly. Hesitation or moral objection could result in reprimand, reassignment, or worse. Diaries recovered after the war recount moments when even junior assistants were ordered to kill prisoners with injections, suffocation, or blunt instruments to study post-mortem effects on organs and tissues. The normalization of brutality became routine. The psychological effects on staff were profound. Some accounts suggest that certain researchers developed a dangerous sense of superiority, believing that their scientific role placed them above ordinary moral constraints. Others struggled silently, experiencing nightmares, anxiety, or profound guilt that they buried beneath layers of professional detachment. Ishii, aware of this risk, encouraged camaraderie through shared complicity, reinforcing the idea that loyalty to the mission and the empire justified the atrocities. Beyond training, Unit 731 also conducted field education for soldiers who would assist in operations. Japanese Army units attached to the program were given practical lessons in administering biological agents, observing infection, and documenting the spread of disease. Civilians were deliberately misled about the nature of their assignments, often told they were part of routine health campaigns or military exercises. The combination of deception, isolation, and controlled exposure to violence created an environment in which cruelty became normalized. Meanwhile, the experiments themselves became increasingly elaborate. Ishii insisted on testing not just pathogens, but also environmental stresses, extreme temperatures, forced starvation, and exposure to chemical irritants. Prisoners were placed in airtight chambers to simulate gas exposure or in freezing water to observe hypothermia progression. Others were subjected to burns, vivisections, and surgical manipulations without anesthesia. The unit meticulously recorded the outcomes, producing a wealth of data designed to inform the development of biological weapons. Despite the extreme violence, Ishii maintained a veneer of bureaucracy. Reports were filed meticulously, complete with charts, photographs, and clinical observations. These documents, when later captured by Allied forces, provided irrefutable evidence of systematic cruelty. They also revealed the meticulous nature of Japanese military science, a terrifying blend of rigor and inhumanity. The psychological manipulation extended beyond personnel to the local populations in occupied Manchuria and northern China. Villagers living near the facilities were unaware of the scale of operations, but were conditioned to comply with the presence of Japanese soldiers. Rumors of disease, quarantine, and punishment kept civilians in fear, ensuring that Unit 731's activities went largely unobserved and unchallenged. The combination of secrecy, fear, and authority allowed the experiments to continue without interruption for years. Even as the war intensified elsewhere, the unit operated with chilling efficiency. Field experiments expanded to include aerial dispersal of pathogens, contaminating water supplies, and deliberate exposure of enemy troops during campaigns. Each mission was carefully planned, executed, and documented, reinforcing the sense that Unit 731 was both a research laboratory and a weaponized entity. The line between science and warfare had effectively vanished. But the more entrenched the program became, the more Ishii recognized the risk of exposure. As Allied victories mounted in 1944 and 1945, discussions within Japanese high command shifted from expansion to preservation. The realization that surrender could bring investigators and prosecutors to Manchuria prompted Ishii to develop plans for both destruction of evidence and disappearance of personnel, a strategy that would only partially succeed. In retrospect, the psychological conditioning of Unit 731 personnel was as crucial to its operation as the pathogens themselves. By dehumanizing both victims and staff, Ishii created an environment in which mass murder could be pursued as scientific inquiry. It was this calculated manipulation of human behavior, the combination of ideology, fear, and obedience, that made Unit 731 one of the most horrifying instruments of state-sanctioned cruelty in modern history. Yet even as the staff adapted to their grim roles, the consequences of their actions were beginning to ripple outward, affecting entire communities, destabilizing regions, and leaving a legacy of trauma that would last for generations. The story of Unit 731 was not only one of science and war, but also of human psychology weaponized to commit atrocities. By 1939, Unit 731 had shifted from laboratory-contained experiments to large-scale field operations, testing their biological weapons on unsuspecting civilian populations. The program's expansion reflected both Ishii's ambitions and Japan's increasing desperation as the war in China dragged on. He realized that to fully understand the efficacy of pathogens like plague, cholera, and anthrax, controlled laboratory conditions were insufficient. They needed real-world application. Villages across northeastern China became testing grounds. Residents were often lured with promises of medical aid or vaccination campaigns, only to become unwitting subjects in experiments designed to measure infection rates, mortality, and transmission dynamics. Some villages were deliberately contaminated with fleas carrying plague. Water supplies were poisoned with typhoid bacteria. Food stores were infiltrated with cholera pathogens. Survivors' accounts describe sudden outbreaks of fever, vomiting, and delirium, followed by mass deaths within days. Those who exhibited symptoms were often left untreated, observed as part of the experiment, and ultimately disposed of to prevent witnesses from escaping. The methodology of these field tests was chillingly systematic. Ishii's teams measured not only the immediate effects of the pathogens, but also environmental variables. They tracked weather conditions, population density, and movement patterns to determine how diseases spread. Reports detailed incubation periods, symptoms, and fatality rates, often accompanied by detailed maps and charts. Soldiers and scientists meticulously documented every death, extracting organs for postmortem analysis to better understand the progression of the disease. Prisoners brought from outside the local area, sometimes Chinese captives, Korean laborers, or Russian POWs, were often used as live subjects for more controlled tests within the compound. These meruta were subjected to vivisection without anesthesia, forced infection with multiple pathogens simultaneously, and exposure to chemical agents. Procedures that would be considered barbaric even by the standards of wartime experimentation were routine here. One report recounts a prisoner being deliberately infected with bubonic plague, observed as the disease took hold, then dissected to study the internal progression. Ishii's vision extended beyond humans. Agricultural sabotage became another facet of experimentation. Unit 731 researchers studied ways to destroy crops and livestock to weaken enemy supply lines. Grain stores were contaminated with pathogens that would destroy food supplies. Livestock were infected with anthrax and other bacterial diseases, designed to cripple rural communities and diminish their ability to support resistance efforts. These operations combined military strategy with experimental science in a way that blurred ethical boundaries completely. Field teams were also deployed during military operations to observe the practical deployment of biological weapons. Planes dropped ceramic bombs filled with plague-infected fleas over target areas, causing panic, disease outbreaks, and deaths among both soldiers and civilians. Soldiers were instructed to monitor the spread and return data for analysis. In some cases, soldiers themselves became carriers, knowingly or unknowingly transmitting infections, creating a grim feedback loop that tested both the pathogens and the Japanese military's ability to deploy them effectively. The scale of these operations intensified as the Pacific War escalated. By 1942 to 1943, Unit 731 had several satellite facilities, each designed to conduct specialized tests. One focused on frostbite, another on chemical warfare, and yet another on the spread of contagious diseases. This network allowed Ishii to pursue multiple lines of research simultaneously, dramatically increasing the efficiency and lethality of the experiments. The human toll grew exponentially, with tens of thousands of civilians subjected to suffering, death, and contamination. Despite the apparent precision of their scientific methodology, the ethical collapse of the program was absolute. Observers from the Japanese military and government were aware of many of the experiments, but largely chose to ignore the moral implications. The results were judged solely by their utility in producing knowledge for the war effort. Ishii's meticulous records, later discovered by Allied investigators, demonstrate a disturbing combination of scientific rigor and complete disregard for human life. Meanwhile, rumors of Unit 731's activities spread among Chinese resistance fighters and local populations, but the Japanese military maintained tight control. Villages were cut off, witnesses eliminated, and survivors silenced through intimidation or execution. The terror enforced by the program extended far beyond the laboratory walls, instilling fear that facilitated the continued operation of the unit. The culmination of these field experiments demonstrated the full scope of Unit 731's capabilities. The creation of weapons capable of inflicting mass casualties with a subtlety that conventional arms could not achieve. Unlike artillery or bombs, these pathogens were invisible, insidious, and capable of spreading far beyond the intended target. Ishii's vision of biological warfare as a strategic weapon was chillingly prescient, highlighting a dimension of modern conflict that would haunt military planners for decades. Yet even as these operations expanded, cracks began to appear. The logistical challenges of maintaining secrecy, the unpredictable nature of biological agents, and the psychological strain on staff created vulnerabilities. Disease sometimes spread beyond intended targets, occasionally infecting Japanese personnel. Ethical and moral tensions among staff occasionally surfaced, though rarely resulting in open dissent. These factors hinted at the precarious balance that Unit 731 relied upon: meticulous planning, ruthless discipline, and constant secrecy. As 1944 approached and the war turned against Japan, Ishii's focus shifted toward preserving the research at all costs. Evacuation plans, destruction of evidence, and contingency protocols were drafted. The very knowledge that had made Unit 731 so formidable now became a liability, one that would determine whether the architects of these atrocities could evade justice. The legacy of these field operations would outlast the war itself. The combination of scientific ingenuity, moral corruption, and military ambition created a chapter in human history defined by suffering on an unimaginable scale. Villages decimated, families destroyed, and survivors haunted for decades. All were part of a systematic program that had been meticulously designed, executed, and nearly erased from history. As Japan faced inevitable defeat in 1945, the question of accountability for Unit 731's crimes became unavoidable. Yet the end of the war did not bring immediate justice. Instead, it introduced a complex and morally troubling chapter in post-war history, where strategic interests often overrode human ethics. When Allied forces arrived in Manchuria and northeastern China, they were confronted with evidence of atrocities that went beyond the conventional horrors of wartime combat. Soviet investigators, as described in previous parts, documented the extent of the experiments, the specialized equipment, and the scale of human suffering. Yet even with this evidence, the task of prosecuting Unit 731 members was fraught with difficulty. Many had already fled, changed identities, or were shielded by Japanese military authorities. Others were captured, but geopolitical considerations soon complicated the prospect of full accountability. The United States, aware of the strategic value of biological warfare research in the emerging Cold War, made a controversial decision. In exchange for full disclosure of Unit 731's experimental data, top researchers, including Shirō Ishii, were granted immunity from prosecution. American officials rationalized that the intelligence gained could be vital in understanding and defending against future biological threats, particularly in the context of potential Soviet development of similar programs. As a result, many architects of the human experimentation survived and went on to influential positions in medicine, science, and industry.